Many of you requested me to review MX Linux, and it took some time for me to get my hands on this distribution, and I even didn't notice how MX Linux climbed to the #1 on DistroWatch. So now it is the most popular Linux distribution according to DistroWatch. So let's review this distribution and see why it is so popular and if it's really so good. It is MX Linux 2020 review. So what is MX Linux? MX Linux is quite a recent distribution which is based on Debian. And you can read on this website that they provide two desktops. One is XFCE, which is their flagship, and they have also introduced KDE and Fluxbox desktops. You can check all these distributions if you want, so I will pay most of my attention to XFCE distribution in this review, but I will also have a look at KDE because, as you know, KDE is my favorite desktop environment, and I was very curious to check how KDE looks and performs in MX Linux. But if you want maximum performance and maybe less fancy desktop, you can also try Fluxbox. But if you followed my channel for a while, you know that Debian XFCE is actually my favorite XFCE distribution, and I talked about that in my Debian XFCE review, so please check it out. I leave the link to the video and to this blog post in the description. And Debian is a great base because it gives you stability. The only problem is with Debian you don't get the latest software, but I think that is fine if you use XFCE, because XFCE is not updated often. For example, right now it is version 4.14 and it has been this version for quite several years. So in general you get very stable base and very stable desktop environment. Now let's have a look at pros and cons of this distribution. MX Linux has many positive things, that's why maybe it is so popular. For example, MX Linux is one of few distributions where you can still download 32-bit versions. And this is very good if you have very old hardware which does not support 64-bit. You can still download and install MX Linux on it. And given that it uses XFCE, it is a very light distribution, so most likely you will have very pleasant experience with this distribution even on very old hardware. So this is one of the advantages. Another advantage is, in general, MX Linux is very well pre-configured by default. And if you follow my channel, you know that I do many videos on things to do after installing different distributions. So MX Linux is not exception. I will also make a video on things to do after installing MX Linux. So please subscribe to make sure you will not miss that video. But right now I can already tell you that there are many things which have been done right in MX Linux. So for example, in many Linux distributions I recommend to reduce swappiness, but you don't need to do that in MX Linux because it is reduced by default. So the default swappiness value is 15, which is great for most users. MX Linux will use your RAM at maximum and will try to use your hard drive only when you reach maximum of your RAM memory. So this is very nice. It also has many packages pre-installed. For example, you already have microcode pre-installed. So your processor will receive all the necessary firmware updates by default. But many Linux distributions don't install microcode, and this is what I recommend to do after installing some Linux distros. But you don't need to do that in MX Linux because it has been done for you already. So this is also very nice. If you go to the list of installed programs, you will also see that most of these programs just the best Linux programs you can get. And if I had to create a Linux distribution, I would probably select almost the same programs as have been selected by MX Linux team. I would make maybe slight changes. For example, by default they have Clementine music player pre-installed, but I think Clementine is great, but it is a little heavier than, for example, Deadbeef. And given that it is a light desktop environment, XFCE, I would install Deadbeef player because to me it is lighter and simpler and it fits much nicer to this desktop environment. But the rest of the tools are just fantastic and I cannot say anything. Like, in general, I would keep everything as it is now. For example, even for backup, they use Lucky Backup program, which I reviewed in one of my previous videos, and I recommend to use this program if you want to create backups for your system with some advanced settings. Please watch that video if you want to learn more about this. So in general, the first impression is very good. It seems to be a well pre-configured distro by default. Now let's have a look at KDE version. KDE version in many ways is similar to XFCE version, but it has some slight modifications. But my first impression was also very positive, because right from clicking on this menu, I can see that they use my favorite KDE menu. So this is the menu where you can see all the categories here, instead of using the other menu, which you can access from here if you go to Alternatives, Application menu, Switch. So this is a menu which is usually used by most of Linux distributions with KDE desktop environment. But as you can see, MX Linux uses my favorite KDE menu. And this is what I usually do after installing any Linux distribution with KDE desktop environment. I switch to this menu. You don't need to do that in MX Linux. It has been done for you already. So this is great. Most of these programs are exactly the same as in MX Linux with XFCE desktop environment, except for some few programs. For example, they have Digicam program, which is a photo management program, and it is not installed in XFCE version, but it is installed in KDE. And I think it is the best program to manage images. So if you have many photos, this is a great program to manage them. There are some other picks which are KDE specific. For example, they installed KTorrent here, which is very nice. I also like that they picked up Thunderbird instead of Kmail. I think Thunderbird is much better. The rest is very similar here, I would say. My first impression from KDE version of MX Linux is also very positive. I also have to mention that MX Linux is one of few distributions which provide very extensive documentation for their distribution. For example, on the desktop, you can click on this manual and you will see that it contains almost 200 pages with instructions for anything you want. So if you go here, you will probably find answers to all your questions, especially if you're a new user. And I would say it is very well written, it is very brief, concise, straight to the point, and it mentions all the best tools which I would recommend. So if you want to learn a little more about what you can do with MX Linux, I highly recommend you to check this manual. You can also have a look at the frequently asked questions, which are also provided here on the desktop, and you can quickly get your answers to the most frequently asked questions. It's not a big document, it's just 3 pages, so have a look. But MX Linux is also famous for its community. I would be honest with you, I didn't have any problem with MX Linux, so I did not have to reach the community and ask questions. But you can see that they have a forum with many questions here, and most of these questions get answered. So if you are curious about something, or if you have some problem, post it here. I believe you will get help very quickly. Also, on the website you can see that they care about users and they provide a lot of things here. Just if you go to the support tab, you can see that they have list of known bugs, they have their forum, the manual which I have shown you is provided here. But moreover, if you click on this video tab, you can see that they also provide video tutorials and guides to some common things which people usually do with MX Linux. So this was very nice, I was very happy to see this, and just from this you can see that the creators of this distribution really care about the user and they try to deliver high quality product and also high quality support. So this is very nice, this is another pros of MX Linux. And my favorite and probably #1 reason to install MX Linux is MX Tools. So the creators of this distribution, they have collected all the possible configuration tools you will need in one place and make graphical interface for all of these tools. So if you install MX Linux, you can configure basically everything without touching the command line. So this is very nice. Just have a look at the list of the tools which are available here. There are a lot of things you can do just from single click here. For example, you can create a snapshot of your system. So this is very nice. You can back up everything, and in case something goes wrong, you can go back and recover your system just using this snapshot tool. But you can also back up different files using Lucky Backup, which I showed you previously. You can configure your boot options. You can clean your system. If you need to create different users, they also provide a nice interface here. Moreover, you can even edit the menu here. This feature is very handy in, for example, Plasma 5 desktop, but it is now also available for XFCE with MX Tools. If you use NVIDIA card, you can install here NVIDIA driver. You can also install all the necessary codecs just with this simple tool, which I will show in my video on things to do after installing MX Linux. So if you are not subscribed yet, remember to subscribe. They also provide Conky menu, which you can see here on the right, and you can configure it also from these MX tools, which again I will show in my video on things to do after installing MX Linux. There are many other things. Most of these handy tools are hidden here in the tweaks. So you can see, you can configure your panel, you can configure your theme. If you experience some screen flickering, you can configure your compositor here, and it most likely will remove screen flickering. They even provided some unique features here. For example, in XFCE, if you have high DPI screen, you can change the scaling from 1 to 2 and to 3, and I think even to 4. But in MX Linux, you can do fractional scaling. You can actually, for example, scale it into 1.2. So this is a very unique feature of MX Linux. If you use high DPI screen, I believe you will be very happy with MX Linux. There are a few other options, which again I mostly show in my video on things to do after installing MX Linux. Sorry for mentioning it so many times, but I believe that video will be very handy for you. So there are many other things. You can even format your USB from here, which is also very useful because some new users, they may get lost and they don't know how to format their USB, and sometimes they can even damage their system. But with this simple graphical tool, you can quickly format your USB drive. I would say it is a fantastic tool which is provided by MX Linux team, and if you don't want to go to command line but you still want to tweak and configure your system to the maximum of its possibilities, MX Tools is definitely for you. Another great feature of MX Linux is MX Package Installer, which you can access from here. And its advantage is they have pre-selected list of software which you can install if you have never installed Linux. And if you go through this list, I can already say that this is a fantastic list of software, and most of these programs which are listed here are programs which I would also recommend. In the browser tab, you can install Chromium or even Google Chrome if you prefer that one, but I recommend you to use Chromium because it is open source. I know that many users started to use Brave browser, and some of them have problems installing it even in Ubuntu, but you can easily install it in MX Linux by just selecting it here and clicking the install button. So this is very handy feature. And if you go through all of these categories, I'm sure you will find exactly what you want. And if you are not sure about what program to use, just pick any of them which is listed here. Most likely it will be a great program. I'm sure you will not regret installing it. But if you want to install more programs, you can go to this stable repo. So it lists only programs which are stable and have been tested by MX Linux team. If you want to have the latest program and you want to take some risk, you can install programs from MX Test repo, which is also very nice, because I know some users prefer to use the latest program. MX Linux has a Debian base, so the software is usually not the latest, and sometimes it's even old software. But with the test repo, and especially with Debian backports, you can install more recent versions of those software. But if you want to be safe and if you want to use the latest program, you can use Flatpaks, and I think this is a great option. For example, I often use KDE in Live, because I use KDE in Live to edit these videos, and if MX Linux was my default distribution, I would definitely install KDE in Live using Flatpak. So here it is, and it is almost the latest version available here. If I compare MX Linux to Debian, this is definitely one of the advantages of using MX Linux versus Debian distribution. But of course, if you are more advanced user, you can go directly to Synaptic Package Manager and skip MX Linux package installer. I usually use Synaptic in all Debian-based distributions, and although it is very old package manager and it doesn't look very fancy, it is very advanced package manager and it has all the features. The only problem, it does not have fancy images and fancy icons, but you can read all the information about packages here. Besides standard software managers, here you have a list of all available packages and libraries, so you have more power over your system. You can also check these packages by their status, by their origin. You can apply some custom filters here. Synaptic Package Manager is the best package manager, but it is for little more advanced users because, as I say, it does not have the most user-friendly interface. But after you have learned Linux, I believe this is the place to go, and I personally use only Synaptic Package Manager for everything I install on my system. Even in KDE Neon, which is my default Linux distribution, I use Synaptic Package Manager to install programs. So this is another advantage of Emacs Linux. KDE version does not have Synaptic Package Manager, it has Muon Package Manager, which is very similar to functionality of Synaptic Package Manager. And I think it is even nicer touch here because this is more KDE specific than Synaptic. So I think it is very nice to see that Emacs Linux team not simply installed KDE desktop on the top of their distribution, but they also fine-tune it and try to make it a bit unique and a bit specific, and Muon Package Manager is a very nice addition to this. I think it is much more stable and reliable than Discover Package Manager, which is the default, for example, in KDE Neon distribution. If we speak about package management in KDE version of Emacs Linux, I would say it is a nice choice and it is also advantage of Emacs Linux. Emacs Linux also has some small touches which are worth mentioning. For example, if you go to the menu, very likely you will see this Adblocker which is pre-installed in Emacs Linux. And this is very nice because it will block ads system-wide on your computer. The only disadvantage of this program is you need to pre-configure it. And I will show how to do that in my next video on things to do after installing Emacs Linux. You can also see Flash Player, which is also pre-installed in Emacs Linux. And it is a bit controversial. I know that many of you will complain in the comments that it is a security problem for Emacs Linux. And I agree with you on that side, but I actually was surprised to discover that there are still many bank websites which use Flash. And some users, they cannot access their online banking because it uses Flash. But with Emacs Linux, they will have access to those websites. I would say even I use Adobe Flash Player sometimes when I need to access some old websites. So it is a controversial topic, but for many new users, I think they would prefer to have Adobe Flash Player and maybe have little security risk than not having that player and not having access to many websites. Another thing is that Adobe Flash Player is not pre-installed in KDE version. I don't know why they did not install it in KDE version, but this is just for you to know. And the third point is, if you open terminal, you will also see that this is not a standard bash terminal which you probably see in many other Linux distributions. Emacs Linux team has actually spent some additional time and pre-configured this bash theme, and this is also very nice. And I would say it is very pleasant theme, and I'm actually considering to borrow this theme from Emacs Linux and pre-configure it on my KDE Neon desktop. This is another small touch which is very nice to see in Emacs Linux. You can see that this distro definitely has been done with some love. I also really like that Emacs Linux does not have Hibernation enabled by default. If you try to shut down your system, you will only see the options to shut down, restart, suspend, but no Hibernation. And I think this is very good because Hibernation often doesn't work right in Linux, unfortunately. Some new users may hibernate their system and then they will encounter problems. But since it is disabled by default, new users are saved from those mistakes. But they can suspend their system, which is very similar to hibernate. The only problem is with suspend, your computer will still use little power, so if you're on a laptop, you should not suspend for a long time. I even recommended to disable hibernation in some of my videos, for example on Linux Mint. But in Emacs Linux you have hibernation disabled by default, and this is very good. But of course nothing is ideal, and Emacs Linux also has some cons. For example, when I install it, I would say that the installer is not the simplest and the most user-friendly, especially for new users. For me it was okay because I consider myself a little bit more advanced user than many other users, but I believe some newcomers who install Emacs Linux the first time, they may not find it completely intuitive and clear. Of course, there is some instruction on the left, which is very nice to have, but I still think that having a little bit better installer would help a lot Emacs Linux. This is not completely negative aspect, but if I had to say something what I was not very impressed with, I would say the installer was not very impressive. And the second, and this is probably the most problematic part, when you just start Emacs Linux, you will see that it has a panel on the left. And to me, this is the most controversial part they did, because I don't think most of users are used to have this panel on the left. Moreover, the location of different elements on this panel is completely unusual. I was lost even myself in this panel, and I had to move it down and create my desktop as you can see it now. Also, the default theme looks like this, and to me it is very 90s look, so I prefer to have something more modern, and that's why I tweaked my system to look like this. And I think if MX Linux had this theme or similar theme as a default theme and this layout, I would say it was almost perfect Linux distribution. Speaking about the cons of KDE version of MX Linux, if you go to MX tweaks in KDE version, you will see that these tweaks are much more limited than tweaks version in XFCE distribution. I understand why, because XFCE is their flagship and KDE is just addition, but if I had to ask something, I would ask maybe a little more features in KDE tweaks. Also, unfortunately, in KDE version you have Hibernation enabled. It is disabled in XFCE version, but it is enabled in KDE version. And there is no Adobe Flash Player in KDE. It's not probably a drawback. It is a difference with XFCE version, and since XFCE version has Flash Player, maybe it would make sense to have a Flash Player in KDE version as well. The major problem of KDE version of MX Linux is that Plasma 5 is quite old. And the problem with this version of Plasma 5 is that it's not long-term support version, and nor it is the latest Plasma. But I cannot blame on this MX Linux team, because they took Debian base for this, and Debian has this version of KDE. And when I reviewed KDE version of Debian, I actually was quite happy with it, but now Plasma 5 has developed so much, and I think it is better to use some other distribution which have a bit latest Plasma desktop. But if you are conservative and you are happy with this version of Plasma, of course I cannot say anything against MX Linux, so you can use it. So speaking about other drawbacks, I would say that MX Linux boots quite slow in comparison to many other Linux distributions. You actually feel that it boots slow, you wait quite a while before your system starts, but many other Linux distributions boot much faster. But after you have booted and logged in into your system, it is very fast and smooth, so you just need to start your system and wait a bit. Also, when you have just started MX Linux, you will see that it uses single click by default, and this is another topic for debate. From the comment sections under my videos, I see that many users actually switch to single click, but I think most of new users and myself, although I'm not a new user, I prefer to use double click because to me it is a more traditional behavior. But of course it is a matter of taste. But given that it is distribution for wide audience, I think double click behavior would be much better. Another thing is MX Linux tried to build all these tools with MX tools, and these are tools very nice, but unfortunately some of them still use command line interface. For example, if you go to Update Manager and click reload, you will be presented command line interface during the update process, which is fine, but some new users may get a little bit scared here. Also, they have this ALSA mixer program, which if you open you will see it has this command line interface, which is not very intuitive how to use and how to configure it. Even I could not quickly figure out how to use it, so I believe some new users will be completely lost. So maybe I would reduce the amount of these command line interface tools in MX Linux, but again, it's just my personal opinion. You also have some programs which are redundant a bit. For example, you can have information about your system if you open a program which is called Quick System Info, and it will show you the information about your system in the terminal view. On the other hand, you can also go and open Graphical System Information tool, which will show you almost the same information but presented in a nicer graphical interface. So I don't know, I would probably keep only one of them, and of course I would keep just the graphical tool. But MX Linux team decided to put both of these tools together. And the final point is, it's nice to have Conky in MX Linux. I would say it's even very good to have it. but I think it could have a nicer theme, because it only shows you the clock by default. So I would use maybe some other Conky theme. For example, this theme is very nice, because it gives you almost complete information about the behavior and state of your system. And many new Linux users would be actually very impressed and happy to have this information by default. Because, for example, when I started to use Linux, I even didn't know that such tool existed, and I didn't know that you can have a quick overview of your system state with a Conky. I think it is nice to have Conky, but I believe the default theme is not very nice, so I would say it is cons of MX Linux. If they switch to some more fancier Conky theme, that would be of course a pros. So XFCE and KDE version of MX Linux are great for beginners, especially for those who want to tweak and explore their system. I think it is a nice way to learn Linux, because you will have access to many tools with graphical programs which are available in MX Tools. So this is very nice distribution for beginners and those who want to learn more. But if you are a complete beginner, I think you can get a little bit overwhelmed with all these settings. So I would recommend something simpler for complete beginners and for those who don't want to tweak their system too much. For example, you can install Linux Mint XFCE version, which I think is the best for complete Linux newbies. With KDE edition, as I say, it is a bit controversial. It has some advantages because it comes well pre-configured by default, it has MX tools, but Plasma 5 version is kind of old and it is not as polished as XFCE version. So if you ask me about KDE, I would recommend some other Linux distros. KDE Neon is my favorite, but you will need to spend quite some time to configure it. Of course, you can follow my videos on things to do after installing KDE Neon, and you will get the best Linux distribution with Plasma 5 desktop environment. But if you like XFCE, MX Linux is a great choice, and I definitely recommend you to go with XFCE version of MX Linux. It's probably one of the best XFCE distributions. Thank you for watching.